Number 1. Clementine Barnabet. In the early 1900s, Louisiana's backroads carried whispers of something unholy. Families were being slaughtered in their beds, entire households wiped out in a single night. And the name that surfaced from the blood-stained rumors was one no one expected: Clementine Barnabet. Born in 1894 in St. Martinville, Louisiana, Clementine grew up in poverty, surrounded by instability and violence. Her father was known for abuse and cruelty, and by her teenage years, Clementine's life had already spiraled into neglect and survival on the streets. But what she became known for went far beyond hardship. It became one of the most terrifying chapters in Southern crime history. Between 1911 and 1912, a wave of axe murders swept across Louisiana and eastern Texas. Whole families were killed as they slept, their bodies left hacked and mutilated. Panic spread through the small towns, as no one seemed safe and no pattern could be traced. Authorities were desperate for answers, and eventually suspicion turned toward a young black woman who appeared ordinary by day, but whose name was whispered with fear by night: Clementine Barnabet. When she was finally arrested in 1912, investigators uncovered testimony that shocked even hardened detectives. Clementine confessed to being part of a shadowy religious cult known as the Church of Sacrifice. She claimed that she and other members had been ordered to kill as an act of devotion, to spill blood as a twisted form of worship. Her confession included chilling detail: up to 35 murders, including men, women, and children. Whether those numbers were true or exaggerated remains debated to this day. But the weight of her words spread fear through every community touched by the killings. Clementine was convicted of at least one murder, the killing of Randall Andrus and his family. In court, she appeared calm, composed, even detached, while recounting unspeakable violence. The press labeled her a voodoo murderess, and sensational headlines turned her into both a villain and a mystery. She was sentenced to life in prison at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, but the story did not end there. Years later, records suggest that Clementine was quietly released, disappearing from public view. No one knows exactly what became of her, whether she died in obscurity or lived out her life under another name. What makes her legacy so feared is not just the number of murders she confessed to, but the way she framed them, as acts of faith, sacrifices demanded by something higher. Whether it was delusion, manipulation, or truth, her story turned belief into a weapon and left an entire region gripped by terror. Clementine Barnabet's case remains one of the most haunting mysteries in American true crime. Was she truly part of a cult of killers, or was she a disturbed woman who carried the burden of crimes larger than herself? The answers may have been buried a century ago, but her name still lingers as a shadow across the South. Number 2. Roberta Elder. In the 1950s, Atlanta was a city on the rise: new buildings, growing suburbs, and families chasing the promise of stability. But hidden behind the curtains of one modest home, a quiet horror was unfolding. It was a case that left doctors puzzled, neighbors suspicious, and authorities struggling to understand how so much death could follow one woman: Roberta Elder. Roberta was born into poverty in the early 1900s. By the time she reached her 40s, she was known as a struggling mother, trying to hold her household together while living in one of Atlanta's poorest neighborhoods. Outwardly, she appeared ordinary, overlooked even, but inside her home, a disturbing pattern was taking shape. Over the span of several years, members of Roberta's own family began to fall ill. At first, it looked like a streak of tragic misfortune: strange fevers, wasting sickness, and unexplained pain that grew worse over days and weeks. But what startled doctors most was how many deaths seemed to happen under the same roof. Husbands, children, and other relatives, one after another, died after brief and mysterious illnesses. It wasn't until the mid-1950s that suspicions became undeniable. An autopsy on one of the victims revealed something chilling: arsenic. Not the kind used accidentally in household products, but deliberate poisoning. Investigators began to piece together what had been hiding in plain sight. Roberta Elder was arrested and accused of killing multiple family members with poison. In total, authorities linked her to more than a dozen suspicious deaths, though they were only able to formally pursue charges in some of them. What shocked the community was the betrayal at the heart of it. These weren't strangers, nor enemies, but the people who trusted her most, her own family. During questioning, Roberta denied everything, insisting she was innocent. The courts ultimately convicted her in just one of the poisonings, but suspicion of many more never went away. Doctors and prosecutors alike believed she was responsible for far more deaths than the jury ever heard about. Her motive was never clear. Some speculated it was tied to insurance money, others believed it was resentment or the twisted need for control over those closest to her. Whatever the reason, the trail of death in her wake made her one of the most feared women ever connected to Atlanta's history. Roberta Elder's story is less known than some of the sensational headlines of her era, but in the records of Georgia's criminal past, she stands out as a chilling reminder of how evil can hide inside the very heart of family. Poisoning is a crime of patience, of calculation, of intimacy. It requires trust and then shatters it completely. In the end, what made Roberta Elder so terrifying wasn't just the number of deaths, but the thought that anyone under her care could be next. For those who knew her, even survival came with a shadow. The haunting realization that their lives had hung in her hands, balanced on a spoonful of poison. Number 3. Celeste Simone Carrington. In the early 1990s, Silicon Valley was booming, tech companies were rising, neighborhoods were expanding, and California's Bay Area carried the energy of innovation and progress. But behind that promise, another story was unfolding. A story of burglary, fear, and 2 brutal murders that would leave one young woman known as the Fatal Beauty. Her name was Celeste Simone Carrington. Born in 1962, Carrington grew up in the Bay Area. Friends described her as attractive, charismatic, and clever, someone who could blend into nearly any social circle. But beneath the surface, her life was riddled with instability. By her early 30s, she had drifted into petty crime and theft, eventually escalating into something far darker. In 1992, Carrington began a series of burglaries targeting upscale apartments and homes. At first, it was money and valuables she was after, but soon her crimes took a violent turn. In San Carlos, she shot and killed 34-year-old housing inspector Victor Kwan while breaking into an apartment complex. Not long after, in Palo Alto, she murdered Peggy Klinke, a 58-year-old woman, during another burglary. These were not impulsive acts, they were deliberate, cold, and carried out at point-blank range. Investigators were stunned. Female killers were rare, and in California, black female killers were almost unheard of. The brutality of Carrington's crimes, combined with the randomness of her victims, sent shockwaves through the Bay Area. Residents who once felt safe in their homes now locked doors tighter, looked twice at strangers, and whispered the same question: who would do this? Carrington's arrest came after a trail of stolen goods and witness testimony tied her to the crimes. In court, the prosecution painted her as a calculated predator who turned burglaries into opportunities for murder. They highlighted her lack of remorse and her willingness to kill anyone who stood in her way. The jury agreed. In 1994, Celeste Carrington was convicted of murder, burglary, and special circumstances that made her eligible for the ultimate punishment. She was sentenced to death, the first black woman ever sent to California's death row. Her case stood out not just for its violence, but for its rarity. In a state with one of the largest prison populations in America, Carrington became a singular figure. A black woman condemned to die for cold-blooded murder. Today, Carrington remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Her death sentence still on record, though executions in the state have been halted. For many, her story is a reminder of how quickly crime can escalate from theft to violence, and how fear can spread when the killer is someone you least expect. Celeste Simone Carrington's name still lingers in California's prison history, not only as the Fatal Beauty, but as a symbol of betrayal and brutality hidden behind charm. She looked like someone who could walk through a door and win your trust. Instead, she left behind blood, fear, and a place on death row that no one has ever forgotten. Number 4. Kimberly McCarthy.
She is the first woman executed in the U.S. since 2010.
In the quiet Dallas suburb of Lancaster, Texas, neighbors once knew Kimberly LaGale McCarthy as a woman with a bright smile and a promising future. She had worked as an occupational therapist, was married to a respected professor, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had once walked a different path. But by the mid-1990s, her life had spiraled into addiction, desperation, and murder. Born in 1961, McCarthy had opportunities many envied. She earned her degree, married into an educated family, and for a time lived a stable middle-class life. But cocaine addiction unraveled everything. Divorce followed, jobs disappeared, and soon she was drifting through a haze of drugs, hustling for her next hit. On July 21, 1997, desperation turned deadly. McCarthy went to the home of her 71-year-old neighbor, retired college professor Dorothy Booth. Dorothy was known for her kindness, often helping those around her. That trust would be her undoing. According to investigators, McCarthy used a pretense to get inside Dorothy's home, then attacked her with a knife and a candelabra. She stabbed the elderly woman multiple times, then severed her finger to steal her wedding ring. With Booth's credit cards and cash in hand, she fled. The brutality of the crime stunned even seasoned detectives. Evidence piled up quickly. McCarthy was seen using the victim's credit cards, and stolen items were traced directly back to her. She was arrested and charged with capital murder. During trial, prosecutors portrayed her as someone who had allowed addiction to consume her humanity, crossing a line that could never be walked back. The jury didn't hesitate. Kimberly McCarthy was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 1998. Her appeals dragged on for years, and she remained on Texas's death row as one of the few women ever condemned there. But her case took on another distinction. She would become the 500th person executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. On June 26, 2013, after years of appeals and 2 previous execution dates delayed, Kimberly McCarthy was led into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. Strapped to the gurney, she declined to make a final statement. At 6:37 p.m., she was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Her execution drew international headlines, not only because of its grim milestone, but because of the woman at its center. Once an educated professional, McCarthy's descent into addiction and violence ended with her name etched in Texas death row history. What made her story so feared was the sheer transformation. She was proof that not all killers come from shadows or broken homes. Sometimes they begin as the neighbor you trust, the professional you respect, the friend you let inside your door. And yet, under the pressure of drugs and desperation, Kimberly McCarthy crossed into a place where even mercy could not follow. Number 5. Marilyn Kay.
The woman charged with killing her 2 young children and leaving their bodies in a Santa Ana hotel room made her first court appearance today.
On a September weekend in 2013, hotel staff at a Hampton Inn and Suites in Santa Ana, California, made a discovery that would leave an entire community shaken. Behind the locked door of a third-floor room lay the bodies of 2 children, 13-year-old Jalen Edge and 10-year-old Faith Edge. Their mother, Marilyn Kay Edge, was nowhere to be found. Born in 1971 and raised in the southeastern United States, Marilyn Kay Edge seemed at first to live the life of a devoted mother. She held a business degree, worked as a financial analyst, and was described by some as intelligent and composed. But beneath the surface, her life was unraveling, emotionally overwhelmed, legally embattled, and consumed by a bitter custody battle that would end in tragedy. Marilyn divorced her husband, Mark Edge, in 2007. Their split triggered years of custody disputes across multiple states. Their son, Jalen, diagnosed with autism, was often at the center of the arguments. Marilyn claimed his condition made visits with his father disruptive. Mark, a military veteran, simply wanted to be part of his children's lives. By 2013, after years of delays and accusations, a Georgia judge awarded full custody of the children to Mark. Marilyn was ordered to return Jalen and Faith by September 15th. She never did. Instead, 3 days before the deadline, she drove them from Arizona to California under the guise of a vacation. Disneyland, the beach, places children might dream of. But prosecutors later argued that the trip was part of her plan. On the morning of September 14th, Marilyn intentionally crashed her car into an electrical box outside a Home Depot in Costa Mesa. When police arrived, they found her trying to strangle herself with an electrical cord. She was placed on suicide watch. and then told officers her children were already dead in the hotel room. Investigators determined the method was poison, though officials never revealed the exact substance. Marilyn was arrested and charged with 2 counts of special circumstances murder, murder by poison, and multiple victims. If convicted, she faced life in prison or even the death penalty. Her first court appearance was as chilling as her crime. When asked if she wanted to delay her arraignment, she responded 3 times, "Only if you promise me the death penalty."
Will you waive that right?
Only if you promise me the death penalty.
Is that yes or no?
Only if you.
For Mark Edge, the father who had fought for years just to be present, the loss was unbearable. In an emotional statement, he wrote, "I walk away from the evil deeds of one and carry the grief of 3." The case of Marilyn Kay Edge remains one of California's most haunting reminders of how family disputes can collapse into unthinkable violence. This was not a crime of strangers or chance, but the irreversible decision of a mother. 2 young lives were lost, not to impulse, but to silence. Not in the chaos of the streets, but in the quiet of a hotel room where trust should have meant safety. And in that silence, the line between love and destruction disappeared forever. Number 6. Deborah Denise Brown. In the summer of 1984, fear spread like wildfire across the Midwest. From Illinois to Indiana, from Michigan to Ohio, families were warned not to open their doors to strangers. Behind the panic was a couple whose crimes would be remembered as one of the most violent sprees in American history. At the center of it all was Deborah Denise Brown, a woman who went from obscurity to infamy in just 2 months. Born in 1962 in Ohio, Deborah was one of 11 children. Her childhood was marked by instability, abuse, and cognitive struggles. Doctors documented her IQ as ranging between 59 and 74. She suffered head injuries as a child and was described as deeply dependent, suggestible, and eager to please. Until her early 20s, she had no criminal record. By most accounts, she was quiet, withdrawn, and unlikely to attract notice. But everything changed when she met Alton Coleman. Coleman was already a predator with a long history of sexual violence. When Brown entered his life, she became more than just a companion. She became his follower, bound to him by what prosecutors later called a disturbing master-slave dynamic. Together, they would form one of the most dangerous criminal duos the Midwest had ever seen. Over the course of 8 weeks in 1984, Coleman and Brown launched a cross-state crime spree that left at least 8 people dead, many more assaulted, and entire communities living in terror. Their victims ranged from children to elderly adults, and the cruelty of their methods shocked even seasoned investigators. One of the most heartbreaking cases was that of 7-year-old Tamika Turks. She and her niece were approached while walking home from a candy store. Tamika never returned. She was lured with kindness, only to be murdered, her life stolen in an act of betrayal that remains unforgettable. Coleman and Brown's pattern was chilling. They would charm their way into homes and lives, earning trust before striking without warning. Ligature strangulation became their signature, leaving behind scenes of betrayal and horror. Prosecutors said they often chose African American victims, believing it would attract less attention in black neighborhoods. Their reign of terror ended on July 20, 1984, when FBI agents captured them in Evanston, Illinois, just 3 days after Coleman was placed on the 10 most wanted list. Communities across the Midwest breathed a sigh of relief, but for many families, the scars never healed. In Ohio, Deborah Brown was sentenced to death for her role in 2 murders. Later, her sentence was commuted to life without parole by Governor Richard Celeste, who cited her cognitive impairments and her history of psychological domination by Coleman. Still, in Indiana, she remains under a separate death sentence, making her the only woman on Indiana's death row. Deborah Denise Brown's story is one of influence, fear, and complicity. Was she a victim of Coleman's control, or a willing participant who found her own cruelty along the way? Whatever the answer, her name is now etched into the darkest chapter of Midwest history, a reminder that even the most unassuming faces can become instruments of terror. Number 7. Tiffany Hall. In the fall of 2006, the small community of East St. Louis, Illinois, was shaken by a crime so brutal that it seemed impossible to comprehend. At its center was a young woman who had once been trusted as a friend, a babysitter, and a familiar face. But behind that familiarity was a darkness no one saw coming. Her name was Tiffany Hall. Born in 1982, Tiffany Hall grew up in East St. Louis and was close friends with Jamela Jamie Tunstall, a 23-year-old expectant mother who relied on her for support and childcare. The two had known each other since childhood, attending the same schools and often spending time together. To Jamie, Tiffany was someone safe, someone dependable. But that trust would become the weapon Tiffany used to carry out one of the most horrifying betrayals in Illinois history. On September 15, 2006, Tiffany Hall attacked Jamie inside her apartment. Prosecutors later revealed she struck her pregnant friend repeatedly in the head, killing her. But the violence didn't stop there. In a calculated and disturbing act, Tiffany cut Jamie's unborn baby from her womb, claiming it as her own. Jamie bled to death in the bathtub, her body discarded in a nearby field. Hours later, Tiffany appeared at a park, carrying the fetus, telling others she had just delivered a stillborn child. At first, her story seemed bizarre, but plausible. But cracks began to show quickly. Tiffany refused medical examination at the hospital, and her explanation shifted. Within days, suspicion mounted. Then, 3 days after Jamie's murder, the horror deepened. Tiffany returned to Jamie's home, claiming she was there on her friend's behalf to pick up Jamie's 3 young children. Their father trusted her and allowed her to take them. It was the last time he saw them alive. Investigators believe Tiffany brought the children back to the same apartment where their mother had been killed. There, she drowned all 3, 7-year-old Demond, 2-year-old Ivan, and 1-year-old Jemiah. Their small bodies were later discovered hidden in the washer and dryer of the family's apartment. The truth unraveled when Tiffany confessed to her boyfriend during the funeral for the baby she had claimed as her own. She admitted the child wasn't his, that she had taken it, and that she had killed. Horrified, he contacted police immediately. Tiffany Hall was arrested that same day. In court, Tiffany appeared detached, even cooperative, but investigators described her demeanor as chillingly emotionless. She was evaluated for mental health issues and found to have a below-average IQ, yet she was deemed competent to stand trial. Facing overwhelming evidence, she eventually pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2008. For Jamie's mother, Sandra Myers, the grief was almost unbearable. Yet in a remarkable act of strength, she said quietly, "I have to forgive her. Taking one life won't bring the others back." The case of Tiffany Hall stands as one of the most devastating examples of betrayal in modern true crime. This was not a stranger in the dark. It was a friend, a babysitter, someone trusted. And in that betrayal lies the deepest cut of all. Proof that sometimes the greatest danger is the person you thought you knew best. Across more than a century of American history, these 7 women carved their names into prison records and into the fears of entire communities. From Clementine Barnabet's confessions of cult-inspired bloodshed in the early 1900s to Tiffany Hall's betrayal of a childhood friend in 2006, their crimes remind us that fear doesn't always come from strangers, and danger doesn't always fit the picture we expect. What unites their stories is not just the violence itself, but the way that violence shattered trust. Roberta Elder poisoned those who should have been safest under her care. Celeste Carrington turned from burglary to cold-blooded murder, leaving behind victims chosen almost at random. Kimberly McCarthy was an educated professional, fell so deeply into addiction that she ended her life strapped to a Texas gurney. And Marilyn Kay Edge, a mother, made the irreversible decision to take her own children's lives rather than lose a custody battle. Then there are women like Deborah Denise Brown, whose name will forever be tied to a spree of terror across the Midwest, raising the question of whether she was a manipulated follower or a willing killer. And Tiffany Hall, whose actions showed that sometimes the deepest betrayals come not from enemies, but from those closest to us. For every community touched by these crimes, the fear was not only in the violence, it was in the realization that the killer didn't look like a monster. They looked like a mother, a friend, a neighbor. They wore ordinary faces, but behind those faces was the capacity for extraordinary horror. Today, most of these women remain behind bars, their names etched into the darkest corners of U.S. prison history. Their stories continue to haunt court records, true crime archives, and the families who live with the loss every day. And so the final question remains: were these women born into evil, driven by desperation, or consumed by madness? The truth may never be simple, but one fact is undeniable: America will never forget the fear they left behind. If you've made it this far, let us know your thoughts. Which of these cases struck you the hardest? Do you believe these women were victims of circumstance, or do their choices prove something darker? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the shadows where truth and terror meet.